שלום לכולם, ערב טוב, ברוכים הבאים ביום חורפי זה להרצאתו של פרופסור רוברט ריקלפס בנושא מגוון מינים במסגרת אירועי שנת דרווין באוניברסיטה העברית. אני פרופסור נתן, ראש המחלקה לאבולוציה, סיסטמטיקה ואקולוגיה באוניברסיטה העברית. ההרצאה תהיה באנגלית, וברשותכם אני אציג את המרצה באנגלית. Shalom everybody and welcome to the first Darwin Year lecture in this rainy day. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker today, Professor Robert Ricklefs from the University of Missouri at St. Louis. Professor Ricklefs is one of the leading ecologists of our time, known from his studies on biological diversification and various other ecological and evolutionary topics, with special emphasis on birds. He received many honors and awards and has published more than 350 papers, many of which in topmost scientific journals. He edited several influential books on aging and biological diversity, and authored several excellent textbooks on ecology, 25 copies of which, available in our library here, have been used in our ecology courses throughout the years. Professor Ricklefs made important contribution to the study of the development, growth, life history, reproductive strategies, and aging of birds. On higher level of organization, he works on historical development of ecological communities, and in 1987 he published a highly influential article in Science emphasizing the need to incorporate processes operating at the regional scale and not only at the local scale. In another more recent influential paper published just a few years ago in Ecology Letters, he moved a step forward to argue that except in cases of highly discrete resources or environments with sharp ecological boundaries, local communities do not exist. Even more recently, Professor Ricklefs contributed 2 papers in the Darwin 200 special feature published in the Nature magazine just 2 weeks ago in celebration of Darwin bicentennial birthday. One with Jonathan Losses titled Adaptation and Diversification on Islands, and another with David Resnick titled Darwin's Bridge Between Microevolution and Macroevolution. In this context, I would like to draw your attention to the Darwin Year activities planned at the Hebrew University, which also marks 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species. Starting tomorrow morning, we shall have a 3-day international conference in Bet Zarfat, here in Givat Ram campus. Participants will include Professor Ricklefs and many other leading scholars of evolutionary biology from around the world. In early April, we shall have a national conference in Hebrew in this lecture hall here, and information on these and various other lectures and activities are available in the website of the Authority for Youth and Outreach of the Hebrew University. So let us please welcome Professor Robert Ricklefs, who is going to talk to us today on the origin and maintenance of biological diversity.
Thank you very much, Ron. It's a real privilege to be here, and I've been looking forward to this for quite a long time. So I'm very grateful to the invitation to join with you in the celebration of the Darwin bicentennial or sesquicentennial, depending on his birth or the publication of The Origin of Species. I also realize right now that I'm the only thing that stands between you and dinner, and so I will try and keep my remarks brief, or at least to provide some food for thought, if not more substantive. I'm going to talk about the origin and maintenance of biological diversity. I'm not going to provide a resolution of variation in diversity over the surface of the Earth, which has been a goal of ecologists and evolutionary biologists for a long time. But on the other hand, I think it really provides a topic which draws together many different aspects of the biological sciences and has forced people to consider the work which they do in a much broader context. So ecologists now can no longer think only about the interactions among species or of individuals with their environments in a small area, but they have to also consider the evolutionary context of the systems in which they deal with. And so in a way, it's been a long journey up to this point, and I think that at the present time, we're really in a much better position than we've ever been for posing questions about the maintenance of biological diversity, but not necessarily for answering those questions. A subtext of what I'll talk about tonight really is the way in which we form conceptions about the world around us and the way in which perception and theory interact with each other, which has been prominent all the way through this particular theme. I think that all of us are interested in biological diversity at some level. I mean, I know that as a young child I was fascinated by birds, and I became something of an obnoxious fanatic about bird watching when I was a kid. And this is what really drew me into biology, was fascination with the diversity of organisms on the surface of the Earth and trying to sort of solve some of the puzzles which they presented. I think biologists are well aware of the fact that the number of species, the variety of life varies tremendously over the surface of the Earth. Here in Israel, you're in a particularly rich area with the meeting of many biotas and very unusual fauna and flora. But as we look over the surface of the Earth, we know that there are tremendous variation in numbers. For example, a boreal forest in Alaska might have 2 or 3 or 4 species of tree, whereas a similar area of forest habitat in Amazonia and Ecuador might have as many as 300 species. And so these differences in diversity have been known for a long time and have fascinated us, but yet their explanations are still eluding us in some ways. We can plot now because the data that we have available to us are really quite substantial and quite amazing. So we can begin to plot patterns of diversity over the surface of the Earth. This is one which was put together by Barthelot and Bond, giving the diversity of vascular plants over the surface of the Earth. And you can see the kinds of patterns that we've come to understand, that there are more species in the tropics where it's warm and wet. Mountainous areas in particular tend to have high species richness. Areas that are cold or dry tend to have relatively few species. Variation in species richness over the surface of the globe is clearly related to variation in the physical environment. And there have been many studies over the last decade or so using large global databases that have attempted to elicit the relationships between the physical environment and species richness. And generally people find very good correlations. An example that was just recently published by Kreft and Walter Yetz of plant diversity over the surface of the Earth, looking at local floras from where all of these dots are. So these are the raw data that they worked with over the surface of the Earth, and related the diversity, which are on the vertical axis here in species richness, to various attributes of the environment. PET is the potential evapotranspiration, which is a measure of the sort of the energy level of the ecosystem, the amount of sunlight and heat in the system, the number of wet days related to the water, and so forth. And what one can see, of course, is that there are some relationships, but there's also a tremendous amount of scatter. Putting together a more complex model, which would include many different variables together in a statistical model, one can sort out various relationships that are fairly clear. So, for example, the area of the flora, which is each of these local samples, is, of course, a very important thing. We know that species and area are closely related. Potential evapotranspiration, the number of wet days, topographic variation, and so forth. All of these contribute in a statistical sense to the variety of different species. We also notice that there are differences in the numbers of species in different areas of the region, and particularly the Cape province, this area in southern Africa, has an exceptionally high diversity of species, particularly for its very, very small size and isolation. Similarly, Australia has a rather low diversity of species given the particular physical environment which is found. And so we have patterns that are related both to the local conditions in which these communities occur, but also which are varying among different regions of the Earth owing to other kinds of factors. So the situation is fairly complex, and I will just point out, and you probably realize from the last slide, that the proportion of the total variation in species richness, which is explained by this fairly complex model, is only about 35%. And so even though we have a model, a statistical model, the level of explanation still leaves a lot of variation, which is unaccounted for in some ways. Now, if there is a strong correlation between species richness and the physical conditions of the local environment, does that necessarily mean that diversity is controlled and regulated locally? This is an idea which developed very strongly in the ecology of the 1950s and 60s out of traditions of David Lack and Evelyn Hutchinson, Robert MacArthur, and others, Bob May, that interactions between species within small local areas set limits to the number which could coexist with one another. And a very elaborate theory was developed to determine the number of species which might be able to coexist given certain conditions of the environment. And of course the implication would be that the number of coexisting species would have to vary with the environmental conditions, because these are the patterns that we see. The number of species isn't the same everywhere, and interactions in the tropics would have to allow for the coexistence of more species locally than interactions in temperate and in boreal regions. Several problems, though, come up with these kinds of explanations which just didn't fit completely. One of those was that there are strong regional effects that we've seen. We've seen the Cape Province in South Africa, which has many, many more species than one would expect based on communities in similar environments elsewhere in the world. And we have other types of anomalies, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But there are variations over and above correlations with the physical environment, which are unexplained by any kind of a hypothesis based on sort of local interactions. Another problem with the theories based on local interactions is that the predictions are actually quite ambiguous. First of all, there are other kinds of models which could predict the same kinds of relationships. And as yet, there is no specific model that relates the qualities of the physical environment to the number of species that one would expect to find. So there's no direct relation in a theoretical sense between these two quantities. So there are a number of problems that one would like to overcome. Now, from the standpoint of alternative models, one could envision very simply a model in which we looked at the diversification of a group of organisms over evolutionary time. And if we assume that these organisms had an origin in some particular ecological region, say suppose this was a group that originated in the Mediterranean climate region someplace on Earth and began to diversify, that it's very likely that the diversity of species in that diversifying group of organisms would actually be highest in the ecological zone in which it originated. Because if this particular clade were to occupy other areas, other kinds of ecological areas, there would have to be adaptive shifts from the ecological zone of origin into other kinds of environments, and that these would in some way retard the diversification of that group within those areas. And so it might turn out that in fact the highest diversity is really found in the area in which a group originated and perhaps in which it has had the longest time to diversify. So this is a perfectly simple evolutionary explanation that would give us variation in species richness with regard to environmental variables, the same kind of prediction that might be made out of a hypothesis based on local interactions. So we have this problem that the theory is somewhat ambivalent, and the predictions are not mutually exclusive. They're not unique in any sense. I think one of the really important contributions during the 1960s sort of emphasizes this idea that the local community can be influenced by processes that occur on a much larger scale. And this is the so-called equilibrium theory of island biogeography that was developed by Robert MacArthur and Edwin Wilson and published in this Princeton monograph in 1967. MacArthur and Wilson said that the number of species found on an island is really a function of two kinds of processes. One of those is the rate at which new species colonize an island, which of course will depend upon the proximity of the island to sources of colonists, potential colonists. And the other factor is the extinction of species from a particular island. These two come into balance over time. And so you have a situation here in which the diversity on an island is regulated in some sense by processes that are occurring locally on the island that affect the extinction of populations on that island, and by an external process of colonization from outside, which is continually feeding potentially new species into the island. And so in this particular case, species richness is not related solely to the local interactions or the local qualities of the systems, but rather to the broader context within which the island is embedded. And of course, you can see that one would expect to find a relationship between the rate of colonization and the species richness on various islands. Excuse me?
When you say species, you mean living creatures?
Living creatures, species that we see on the island at present. And so there's a postulated balance between the arrival of new species, which are coming to the island from outside, and the disappearance of species, which are going extinct on the island, and a continual turnover of species. These are living species. Yes. So if we look at the way in which this model is formulated, MacArthur and Wilson said simply, well, we can imagine that the rates of colonization and extinction vary according to the number of species on an island. And their model is very similar to the kind of sort of density-dependent population models that had become popular for the explanation of numbers of individuals in populations, except now we're talking about numbers of species on an island. And as the number of species on the island increases, the colonization rate goes down, simply because the chance that a new arrival is a new species goes down. I mean, if the island has all the species that are found on the continent, on the mainland source of colonists, then a new arrival won't be a new species. And so the colonization rate is going down with increasing diversity, but the extinction rate is going up. And the reason for that is simply the more species, the smaller the population sizes of each individual species, the greater the likelihood that they will go extinct through either environmental or just plain stochastic demographic causes. Similarly, MacArthur and Wilson postulated that the extinction rates would be greater on small islands where populations are smaller than they are on large islands where populations on average would be larger. And one of the consequences of this difference in the extinction rate between large and small islands is that there should be a relationship between island area and the number of species. This is the familiar species area relationship. Now we see this, virtually any group of organisms that one surveys over a range of island sizes will show a very prominent species area relationship. In this particular graph on the top, these are data that Matt Lavin and his colleagues have put together for legumes on islands around the world. And you can see that there is a very pronounced species area relationship. The black dots represent islands in the West Indies, which have a very rich flora of legumes. The red dots represent old islands elsewhere in the world. And the open circles here represent a lot of younger islands, that is, islands that have arisen from the ocean only recently. And it seems that it takes time to develop an equilibrium number of species. And so there are many islands that are actually below this relationship for the older, more developed islands in the world. But typical of almost any group that we look at, we get a very strong species-area relationship. Another thing which is important about this is that as the islands are larger and larger, the proportion of endemic species, that is to say, species that are found nowhere else, increases. And these endemics are species that have been resident on the islands long enough to have evolved distinctive character that will distinguish them from all other species in the world. So these are things that have had a long residence time on islands. And this suggests, of course, that only on large islands can populations last long enough to have undergone these kinds of evolutionary changes. So this became a very, very powerful tool for studying the relationship between diversity and the general geographical context of a particular island. Now we might ask, what happens on islands of different size that have different numbers of species? How are all these species accommodated on that island? How do they sort themselves out ecologically? One example, and this comes from birds in islands of the West Indies and a couple of surrounding areas, that if we look at the number of species on an island, and so this is on the horizontal axis, and then we look at the number of species that occur in local areas of reasonably uniform habitat, say within a few hectares of uniform habitat. And all of these sample areas that are represented here are matched on all of these islands, so that we're looking ecologically at the same kinds of habitats, the same range of habitats on each one of these islands. What we see is that as the diversity on the island as a whole increases, and that's partly because these are larger areas up here, but also because they're closer. In fact, one of these is part of the Central American mainland. So that the regional diversity, though, is reflected in the local diversity. Now, if all the species were found on all the habitats within the island, then the relationship between habitat richness and island richness would follow this dotted line here, which you can't see. So clearly, not all of the species occur in all of the habitats. And in fact, if we take a look at the average number of species and the abundance of those species in local habitats, what we see is that as the regional diversity increases, the number of habitats which are occupied goes down, the relative abundance of the species within those habitats goes down. So the species are being compressed, in a sense, to occupy fewer habitats on the islands as there are more species, and also their individual abundances are going down, as they must if the number of individuals per hectare in an island area is going to remain about the same, and presumably that is limited by the ecology. But the point here is that there is no specific limit to the number of species that is set by the conditions of the environment and by the local interactions of those species. Rather, species are very compressible, and if you add more to an island by the pressure of colonization, or you allow more to accumulate because the extinction rates are low, then the species will just cram into the habitats more tightly, each one of them having a lower abundance perhaps and becoming somewhat more specialized with regard to habitat. But the ecology, the ecological relationships, are quite flexible and sensitive to the number of species that are found locally. So we have then this sort of idea from studies of this kind that there is a tremendous amount of flexibility in the coexistence of species on a very local scale. So up until this point, we have a number of different types of hypotheses. One of them is this idea of local coexistence, which I've talked about. We also have regional and historical influences, which are very important, and I'll give you some more examples. And then I'll also consider another type of argument put forward by Steve Hubble recently, which is basically a random hypothesis. But we'll get to that in a second. Just to show you that the same kind of habitat might support very different numbers of species in different areas, let's take a look at two simple examples. One of these is temperate forest trees, and these Species are widely distributed around the globe in the northern hemisphere. If you go to the eastern United States, to Europe, to eastern Asia, also the western United States, you find forests which would be familiar to anybody from these regions: oak trees, maples, beeches, ashes, and so forth, a very characteristic flora. But the diversity in each of those regions is actually quite different. The black bars represent the number of genera found this is of forest trees found in Europe, in Eastern Asia. You can see quite a disparity between those, Western North America and Eastern North America. Even though the climate conditions which are supporting these forests are quite similar, and of course the flora itself is quite similar, you get tremendous disparity in the numbers of species. If we look at the fossil record, these are the green bars, the number of genera present in the tertiary fossil record, the late tertiary fossil record. We can see that Europe has an equal number to Asia. Of course, Europe has been better sampled in some ways. The fossil record is better known, but nonetheless, the diversity is quite strikingly different than the present number of species. Similarly, in Western North America, there were many, many more genera of trees present there than there are at the present time. And so we can see that the diversity patterns that we see now, which are these black bars, are the result in part of differences in diversity which have occurred throughout the tertiary period, with Europe and Asia being very high compared to North America, but also the recent extinctions of the flora which has occurred in Europe as a result of the general global cooling of the climates. And Europe has suffered from extinctions quite a bit more heavily than other areas of the Earth. And so in this sense, we see that the diversity locally is not really related to the present-day climate or the ability, perhaps, of these regions to support diversity, but actually is related to changes in the Earth over periods of time and the very special geographical configuration of these different regions. Just to show you how strikingly different these temperate areas of the world are. Compare Eastern Asia and Eastern North America here. Eastern North America, these are climate zones, just to give you kind of an overview of the geography of the environments there. North America is, quite frankly, quite boring in terms of its overall ecological diversity. There are only 2 major climate zones in the east. There are no major mountain ranges or other kinds of obstacles to movement. And it's true there have been glaciations, but nonetheless right now it's a very, very uniform environment with very gradual environmental gradients throughout the region. If you look at the eastern part of Asia, though, which is where the comparable forests occur in that area, in China and Korea and Japan, this is an extremely complex area in terms of its climates, in terms of its landforms, with great mountainous areas in the southern part of China here, broad, extensive contacts between temperate and tropical vegetation in Eastern Asia, a lot of opportunity for geographical isolation of populations in this area. And so it's an area which is just made for generating diversity, whereas North America has been relatively quiescent, the eastern part anyway, in that regard. So we see here that the geographical context seems to make a tremendous amount of difference. An even more extreme case in some ways is the situation with the mangrove floras of the world. Mangroves are trees which grow in the intertidal zone in tropical areas, and so their roots are both in salt water and also in anaerobic sediments. And that has made the environment an extremely stressful one for terrestrial vegetation. And needless to say, relatively few lineages, evolutionary lineages of plants, have been able to make the transition between typical terrestrial forests, which are flooded with fresh water and therefore don't accumulate salts and which drain, allowing oxygen to get into the root systems, and these sediments which the mangrove plants grow in. If one looks at the diversity, though, what one finds is in the Indo-Malaysian area, diversity is very high. There are 50 or so species of mangroves in this region, and as many as 30 or 40 growing within a small area, that is to say within a single river mouth or so forth. Whereas in the Western Hemisphere, the number of species is much lower. It depends a little bit on whose taxonomy you follow. but in any one area you never get more than 3 or 4 species. And yet the environments are nearly identical. You have these intertidal sediments, these soft sediments that these plants grow in and favor, and they're virtually indistinguishable as environments between the old world and the new world. So there's been something about not the local ecology, but the history and geography which has influenced this. If we look at the different groups of mangroves very, very quickly, what we find are basically 2 different groups. There are several genera, several lineages which arose early in the tertiary and which are cosmopolitan. That is to say, there are representatives in the Eastern Pacific and Atlantic and Caribbean area, as well as in the Indo-West Pacific, where the diversity is very, very high right now. So these early forming groups, these groups that evolved into the mangrove environment early on, are well represented throughout the world. But then in addition to that, there are a large number of genera and species, each one of these genera representing a new innovation, a new movement of some population into this mangrove environment, involving all kinds of evolution to stressful environments. And that has taken place exclusively in the Eastern Hemisphere, in the Old World. And if one goes back and looks at the geographical situation, one of the things which is most striking is that this area in here is one of very, very shallow marine shelves which are dotted with islands that have arisen and been submerged with changes in global sea level, producing ideal situations for populations to become isolated and therefore to be able to evolve adaptations to be coping with these very strong marine environments. And so it's very likely that the reason why the diversity is so high in this particular region is primarily because of the geographical configuration and the history of the regions. There's nothing similar to that in the New World along the coast of Africa here. There's none of these areas of very shallow marine shelves with islands that become isolated. It just doesn't occur. So in this particular case, diversity seems to be driven by kind of a diversification pump, by the geographical opportunities for forming new species which can evolve the kinds of adaptations which are needed to cope with this very stressful environment. In fact, we can look at this then going back to the simple model of diversification, that perhaps the mangrove environment is one which is extremely difficult to adapt to and relatively few transitions. Only about 20 transitions in the history of the tertiary represent the movement of terrestrial groups into the mangrove environment. So this is a very difficult thing to do, even though it's one of the most productive environments on Earth. Well, let me shift gears just a little bit and talk about another approach to diversity, which has become very much a topic of conversation and discussion during the last 10 years or so. Steve Hubble is an American biologist who has worked for a long time on forest processes, particularly in the tropics, and he is responsible for the development of now a worldwide program of forest plots studying the long-term demography of trees and tree species within these areas in different parts of the world. So it's really quite a remarkable accomplishment. And Steve is also really an accomplished theoretician as well, and he developed during the early 2000, well, a decade or so ago, he came out with this book, one of the Princeton monographs, in which he suggested that one could view communities and diversity as the results of strictly random processes, strictly stochastic processes. He envisioned a situation in which all species are competitively equal, that there basically was no ecology in that sense. And then he asked the question is, what kinds of patterns would we expect from a world in which all species were competitively equal? And it was an interesting exercise in some ways. And of course, this is very similar, for those of you who know about population genetics, this is very similar to the theory of neutral alleles, that is to say, genetic alleles that have no fitness consequences. And it's similar to having species that have no ecological consequences, in a sense, for each other, for their relationships. And in this theory, Hubble was able to predict the size of a meta-community, the number of species in a meta-community, as a function of just two things. One is the size of the meta-community, which meant the number of individuals in the entire meta-community, which you can think of as a large region. And the other is this value nu here, which is the rate of speciation. And there are several different models that can give you a model of how species are produced within this meta-community. But the interesting thing is that the equilibrium number of species in this system is equal to the size of the meta-community, and it's also proportional to the square root of the rate of speciation. So this is a very simple theory, and of course ecologists have always been attracted to simple theories because ecology is so complicated that anybody who can come up with something simple as a way to describe it is sort of put up on a kind of a pedestal in some ways. Well, here's how this theory works. It's a very simple one. I mean, suppose that you have then a sort of a finite population of individuals of all species. And we can just imagine these as occupying a grid. And then one of those dies, and then that individual is replaced by a progeny from somewhere in the population completely at random. In other words, whichever individual replaces this missing one here can be drawn from any individual within this entire meta-community. And it's through this kind of random death and birth of individuals that the proportions of the species within the meta-community will change. Some of them will become more numerous. Some of them will become extinct just because they dwindle at random to extinction. And so in the long term, the rate of extinction and the rate of speciation in the system become balanced. The system becomes into equilibrium. Now, one can also think about the meta-community as being a very large regional pool of individuals and species, and then we can look at our local plot, which might be 50 hectares of tropical forest, and a third parameter, this migration rate, which measures the number of those individuals that are replacing dead individuals within the plot, which come from outside. So M is kind of the proportion of migration into the plot from the larger meta-community as a whole. So we have three parameters, and those parameters make very explicit predictions about such things as species area relationships, about the distribution of abundances within a particular community, and we can then fit the theory to the observed observation. So in this particular case, this is a plot of the species abundance according to the rank. So this is the number 1, the most abundant species, and this is its abundance, and number 2, all the way down to number 250. And so this is for the 50-hectare plot on Barrow, Colorado Island, 20,000 trees over 10 centimeters diameter at breast height, 235 species in this particular plot. And this curve is then fitted very, very accurately by a model which has a value of theta, which is just the meta-community size times the speciation rate, and a migration rate of 0.1. So the fantastic thing is that you can use this simple theory to actually predict the species abundance distributions. Does that mean, however, that the theory actually explains the particular number of species that are in that community and also the distribution of their abundances? Now, these values, 50 and 0.1, are fitted values, all right? Those are not observed values. And what this shows is that you can find values which will actually fit the data quite nicely. But are these values interesting biologically? Are they realistic, or are they just numbers that we have that will fit the distributions that we can find? There are a number of predictions that we can make from this community drift idea about diversity. One of them is that the number of generations required to reach community equilibrium. So all of the theory pertains to a system which is in equilibrium. And that time is approximately equal to the size of the meta-community. So that's a theoretical result, same as the one in population genetics. Also, the average number of generations to extinction is equal to the size of the individual populations in a completely stochastic situation like this, a very random situation. Well, let's think about this for just as a simple example, a pencil and paper example, and we'll pick the trees of the Amazon basin. I think all of you are familiar with the trees of the Amazon basin. But there are approximately in that area about 10 to the 10th, that is to say 10 billion individual trees. On the order of 10,000 species, it might be a little bit more than that, but this gives us an average population of about 1 million per species. And if we assume that the generation time is about 100 years, which is fairly reasonable, it's something which has been observed, the time to community equilibrium is about 10 to the 12th years. And these are numbers that we hear of mostly in terms of the American debt, but in fact this is a long time. You will recognize that this is far longer than the age of the universe. The age of the solar system. Anyway, it's a very, very long time. And similarly, the average time to species extinction, which maybe is a little bit closer to home, is on the order of 10 to the 8th years, 100 million, and that would be about the age of the original angiosperm orders and families. And so it's very unlikely, in fact, that these estimates, that a neutral theory, if one considers the Amazon, the trees of the Amazon basin as a meta-community, it's very unlikely that even though the neutral theory can describe the species abundance relationship locally, those parameters probably have very, very little relationship to any kind of real ecological or evolutionary process. And so this is one of the interesting things about the sort of the development of ecological thought and evolutionary thought in this way, is that theories can be very, very attractive and still be completely wrong, but people nonetheless continue to be very much enamored of them, and a considerable amount of work is going on in this particular area. In fact, I mean, if you thought about a model in which the basic premise is that there is no ecology, I mean, most of us, I think, would not be very tempted to pursue it very far. It has been a very interesting pursuit from a theoretical standpoint, but I think it's not going to help us very much in terms of trying to understand. One might wonder how somebody like Steve Hubble, who is really an outstanding naturalist and biologist, I mean, the man is fantastic, how he got into his head that this theory could, in fact, explain everything. Part of it's a matter of scale. If one looks at a tropical forest sort of from a height of a few hundred meters or so, and thinks about, suppose this tree dies and falls and leaves an open gap, the tree that replaces it, what will eventually grow up there, is going to be the progeny of some tree in the neighborhood, somewhere, maybe within 50 hectares. I mean, seeds can move quite a long distance, and which particular tree will grow back up in that position is very hard to predict. That's the randomness, the stochasticity of this theory. But if you go down to a much more local scale, one thing that's almost clear is that this species will not be replaced by another tree of the same species because of very strong density-dependent effects. That is to say, the progeny of trees do not do well in the neighborhood of their parents because of various fungal pathogens and other kinds of density-dependent sorts of factors. And so, in fact, on the very local scale, there is a very strong ecology going on, and that's ecology that one can measure very easily. And if we extend this view not just out to 50 hectares, but to the Isthmus of Panama, for example, we will also see very striking distributional specialization of trees along the various climatic gradients, rainfall from one side of the isthmus to the other, elevation, slope, and so forth, that there are very strong ecological signals of distribution within that area. And so, in fact, it may be that Hubble, concentrating on this 50 hectares, saw the stochasticity of replacement at that scale, but then tried to extend that to the smaller scales of individual replacement and all the way up to the very larger scales of the region. And so in this way, our perceptions may have been very much clouded by the theory in this way with sort of forgetting the context of that. Well, let's get back a little bit to birds. I can see that I'm running very late and I should actually speed up a little bit. What about diversification itself? Well, one of the things that we've been able to do now during the last several decades is to look at the history of relationships of organisms based on gene sequences, DNA sequences. There's been a tremendous revolution, and phylogenetic hypotheses such as the one which is shown here, happens to be for Proteaceae, for genera in the Proteaceae. These are very commonplace right now, and they tell us a lot about the diversification of a group, where diversification happened. They tell us about the timing of diversification. The amount of information now is absolutely astounding. And there's also developed a theory around diversification, and again, it's sort of a random speciation extinction theory of diversification, which accounts for the growth of clades over time just through these random occurrences of speciation and extinction events. And that theory allows us to fit parameters again to the distribution, for example, of the size of clades. So this is the number of species, and this is the relative age of those clades, and we can fit parameters of a speciation extinction model to these. And again, as in the distribution of relative abundances and fitting these meta-community parameters, we can get estimates of sort of rates of extinction and speciation for various groups of organisms. I'm not going to dwell on that at great length. There are a number of studies which have tried to do that. For example, this is an excellent study by Susanna Magallon and Mike Sanderson, published in Evolution some time ago, in which they looked at the diversity in orders of angiosperm plants and the diversity on a log scale here, the age of the clade estimated from both fossil record and also from phylogenetic work, and they fit various models of diversification to that. All right, and the prediction, of course, is the older the clade, the more the number of species should be. But if one takes away these predicted lines of diversification, what one sees, and these are the same data presented again, that there's no relationship between the number of species and the age of the clade. This is not something we expect. If we do a randomization and we sort of run a simulation of evolution, what we see is that we should expect to find a very strong relationship between clade age and the number of species. And so there's something where the theory, again, doesn't match very well to the idea of differences in diversity. Going back again to birds, these are data for tribe-level clades of songbirds, passerine birds, and you can see here again that at least one measure of the age of those clades is unrelated to the number of species. And so a model of diversity based on rates of diversification doesn't seem to hold very well, because we would expect to find a relationship between age and diversity, which we just don't see. So the question is, what's going on here? The suggestion, of course, is that speciation and extinction are relatively balanced, and in fact, over a long period of time, the size of clades doesn't change very much. I mean, that's sort of the expectation. When we look at phylogenetic reconstruction, we view present-day living species. We examine the DNA and determine the sequence of the nucleotides in the DNA. And from that, we reconstruct the relationships all the way back to an ancestor, where there's only a single ancestor. And this relationship, of course, primes us to view diversification as a growth in the number of species through time. Because looking back through time, towards the beginning, that's exactly what we see. And this is the prejudice, I think, that many of us have had during the last decade or so, that diversification rates really are what determine numbers of species, because it determines how rapidly the clade can grow in time. But suppose that things actually look like this instead, that at the beginning of this time period, whatever it was, there are just as many species as there are at present. But over this period, because of extinctions and species formation, all of these species are the descendants of a single one of these species that occurred at some time in the past. And so what we have here is a situation in which we can have a constant number of species over time, but still get diversification of lineages occurring within that period. And I think this is going to be a much more fruitful way to look at diversity, that in fact it has been relatively constant. Fossil record gives us information about this as well. The number of morphospecies of pollen types on the horizontal axis from an area in northwestern South America from the beginning of the tertiary up until 25 million years or so ago. The numbers, even though they increased during the warm period of the Eocene and have decreased since that, the total numbers have really not changed over 40 million years of that period of history. Over that time, however, this curve here shows that the species have been replaced continually. And in fact, none of the species that were found in these earlier sediments are represented in the sediments at the top. So there's been a complete turnover of species. And this, I think, is very typical of many groups in which we have this kind of information. So we're wondering then about, we have a complete turnover all the time. This is very much like the island biogeography theory, where new things come in through colonization, older species are lost through extinction. We have a similar sort of an idea where the number of species is maintained at a relatively constant level, but there's a continual turnover. We know that this turnover is not the result of completely random extinction, the way it is sort of in the way of Hubble's model, because the time is just not enough. I won't go into the details, but random extinction and speciation are just too slow to account for the kinds of turnover that we see. So what other signals can we find for diversity? And I'll go back again to this example of these clades, these tribes of songbirds distributed throughout the world. As you can see, no relationship between age and number of species. But if we look at the distribution of where these clades evolve, some of them are tropical, some of them are temperate, some of them have evolved in relatively small areas like Australia, others in very large areas like the Palearctic. And we look at a little bit more detail, we begin to see much more pattern beginning to emerge. So for example, the area of the region, that is to say the area of the large biogeographical province in which these groups have evolved, has a very strong predictive effect on the number of species that we're likely to find in those different groups, in those clades. Similarly, the tropical clades represented here in red are generally, especially when size of the area is taken into account, are much larger than the temperate ones, and the ones that are found in both tropical and temperate areas are intermediate. So already now we begin to see that the regulation of clade size depends partly on the size of the region within which these groups are diversifying, and also it seems to be quite different in tropical areas than in temperate areas. So let me try and make some conclusions just to wrap this up about sort of how we think about species diversity now. And this is an area which is continually evolving, that people are, I think, growing much more sophisticated in the way that they view diversity in the larger context of evolution and biogeography, as well as the local context of ecology. So I would say, first of all, that we have a strong relationship of species richness to the physical environment, but this can be brought about either through very direct local interactions on the coexistence of species, or it can also be the result of much larger influences through the history of evolutionary diversification. So we have a hard time of sorting out these two different influences, which are very different from one another. And yet the relationship of diversity to the physical environment is one which has been apparent for a long time. The regional species richness that we see appears to be regulated. And within large areas, extinction and speciation appear to be about the same level. So these numbers of species are in some way being regulated by characteristics of the region and of the environments within that region. These characteristics are completely unknown, and as far as I know, there's no good theory now which really can explain these relationships. Certainly larger regions are likely to have a broader variety of ecological opportunities available. They're likely to present more opportunities for geographical isolation and therefore formation of new species. And it may be these characteristics which are important. why it is that tropical regions tend to have higher numbers of species at equilibrium than temperate regions, again, is very, very poorly understood. Another thing, though, which is important is even though speciation and extinction are, in a sense, stochastic random events, I mean, we're not likely to be able to predict this very easily, their rates are certainly unevenly distributed among lineages, and they also change through time. And we know that the rates of turnover cannot be attributed just to random events. There have to be situations where either within a region you get changes in the climate which are driving some species to extinction and favoring other species, or perhaps there are biological innovations that certain groups of species acquire through evolution which allow them to become dominant and to outcompete other groups of species. There have to be these additional drivers of extinction and species formation in order for the kind of turnover that we see to be able to be explained. And the drivers for this, whether it's environmental change or key innovations, are major challenges, I think, that are really going to, they're going to challenge biologists, particularly ecologists and evolutionary biologists, for quite some time to come. This is a very complex situation, and it's unlikely that we're going to resolve this to anybody's satisfaction of general agreement for a long time to come. However, I like to look at sort of the regional community, if you will, in the following way. First of all, there's a strong influence of history and evolution which leads to the diversification of the organisms that are present there. So this depends on the biogeography, it depends on the evolutionary history, and the particular groups that are diversifying. Within a region, however, we also have a range of environments, and within that range of environments, each species is adapted to a particular range. These ranges might contract or they might expand over time depending on changes in the environment, the physical environment, or on acquired adaptations which allow species to exploit the environment more efficiently, and so forth. And so these are very dynamic distributions within this region. They have both a geography and they have an evolutionary history. If we look locally, our 50-hectare plot, we'll find some set of these species from the entire region that are co-occurring locally. But their occurrence in a single community is the result more of interactions occurring within the entire region and the long history of their diversification and evolution than it is necessarily to their local interaction at a particular point. So I think with this broader view of what a community is and how organisms arise and how they interact, I think that we're poised now for the next decade or so, especially for the younger people who are working on this, to really begin to solve, I hope, some of these very vast and complex, challenging questions. So I leave you with that, and I thank you very, very much for your attention. Thank you. Questions? I would be happy to entertain questions. Yes?
When Darwin made his famous trip with the Beagle through the Galapagos, from island to island,
yes,
all those birds were there like residents of each island. They didn't migrate from one to the other. Or like here in Israel, you come before the winter, millions of birds are coming over here, all the way to Africa, and then back from spring, they're coming, millions of birds coming back. There in the Galapagos, they just sat there, or what?
Yeah, the birds on the Galapagos, obviously they had to get there from the mainland in some way, so some individuals flew from the mainland all the way out to the Galapagos Islands, and one sees occasionally species or individuals of species that aren't found there that accidentally arrive on the islands. So this does happen from time to time. But by and large, these birds are relatively sedentary. There's, of course, limited movement of individuals among the islands because we see certain species that are widely distributed in the islands themselves. And so there's limited movement, but not the kind of movement that we see in migrations. So the limited movement then allows the individual island populations some evolutionary independence so that they can diversify from each other and build the number of species. The single ancestor of Darwin's finches became 13 present-day species, right? And it did that, and 11 of those species are found on one island. And so it did that through both the isolation of populations, which allowed them to diversify and become distinct from each other, and then also occasional movement between the islands, which allowed the buildup of those species on the islands. Ironically, when Darwin traveled through the Galapagos, his attention was focused primarily on the mockingbirds that are there, which there's only one species on any given island. There are 4 species altogether. And Darwin noticed that clearly these birds must have come from the same stock, but they differed from one island to the other. And this was, again, stimulating his idea of the modification of a single original ancestor into different forms. He didn't realize that the finches all came from one stock. He thought they were all different from one another because they're so differently adapted to one another. It was only later when somebody pointed out to him, one of the zoologists in the British Museum said, hey, these are all really closely related to each other. They all came from the same stock. Yeah, anyway. We can talk about evolution for a long time. Yeah. There's one.
I wonder if you use the same methods that we use in chemical kinetics, because I see here that you have consecutive reactions and parallel reactions, not reactions, but if I compare the case in chemical kinetics, you have many parallel reactions and many consecutive reactions, and many of the pathways that you have are probably second order or first order. So you can establish differential equations that describe the situation. It will be coupled equations. You put them in the computer, and then you see whether the computer thinks what you think. So I wonder whether this is a procedure that is, accepted in this field of...
Yes, I mean, in particular about various kinds of chemical reaction kinetics. There have been a lot of analogies in biology and also in ecology to this, and people are actively pursuing some of these areas. Particularly in ecology, there is a so-called thermodynamic theory of ecology which seeks to explain essentially everything on the basis of thermodynamic principles from first principles. Yes, yeah, and I think first of all, one has to test empirically whether or not the relationships are as predicted, and then to ask whether the deviations from those predicted relationships, what's the underlying biological meaning of those. But I think we have the same danger that we also have with the neutral model of Steve Hubble, that you can make the parameters fit, or that is, they will produce the right empirical patterns that you want, but maybe for the wrong reasons. And these are things that we always have to sort out. I mean, are chemical thermodynamics really a good model for what's happening in ecosystems? And they may be.
Well, but when you have many things to reproduce, it's not for the wrong reason, as you say. It has to be the right thing, normally. Well, maybe it's a different issue a little bit.
Well, I'm always impressed because I'm primarily an empirical biologist, and I tend to look at data rather than theory and models first. And I'm always impressed by how different the numbers of species are in what seem like very similar habitats. So the prediction would be you would have similar communities, similar numbers of taxa, and so forth, and yet you get these tremendous differences between them, which must be the result of other factors, right? And that doesn't exclude the operation of some basic principle like neutral relationships or thermodynamic relationships, but it means that things in addition must be acting, but it also means that things in addition may be the primary determinants as well. And I think it's very difficult to sort these things out. Ecologists have been enamored for a long time of simple theory, as I pointed out, and I think it's fantastic to pursue that, but that we have to be cautious as well. Yeah. Here's one.
I think one of the challenges of ecology is the large effort needed to collect data. So this leads to having many theories and not being able to falsify them.
Yeah.
Now that changes in evolution, molecular evolution, do you think that will characterize ecology in the future as well? Will that change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, empirical data are really important, and you run up against kind of a wall if you can't test ideas. And now, if anything, I think that we're seeing a trend for people to abandon natural history, to get in behind their desk, to use data sets which are available on a sort of a global scale, fantastic amounts of data in some ways. But perhaps people are not going into the field as much as they used to collect original data. And my hope is that the development of the concepts now, which are changing, I think, very rapidly and expanding, are going to force people to recognize that we need a different kind of data. People think, I mean, natural history, of course, is something that's been going on for a long time. People have been gathering data forever. But you have to remember that much of that natural history is driven by a particular concept or idea at a particular time. And so we have to continually update our natural history because our own concepts of the world around us are changing. And what's appropriate now is different than what people were looking for 100 years ago. So I'm hoping, that in fact people will continue to derive inspiration from the natural world and also to seek information there. Yeah. There's one more. You people must be getting hungry.
You suggested that the age of the clade is not a good predictor for the amount of species, and then you showed that you can correct this to some extent by the area of origin and the habitat of origin. If you'll include the amount of species being extinct from this clade during this period, won't it improve your prediction significantly? Because you showed that many species of the clade are extinct during the process.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, obviously, different groups of organisms will have different turnover rates, and we don't know very much about that. The fossil records usually are not good enough to have species-level information, and so we don't really know very much about how rapidly species are turning over. I mean, there are ideas that the average species of bird, maybe 1 or 2 million years or something like that, might be a reasonable lifetime for a species of bird, but we don't know about what wasn't there, what has gone extinct. Now, would that help us? It's an interesting question about, so if the diversity of a region is maintained in some equilibrium between speciation and extinction, one can ask whether or not if the speciation rate increases, does that drive that equilibrium diversity to a higher level? And of course, you would expect a more rapid turnover of species at the same time, which would show up in the average lifespans of the species. So in fact, if we could get information about that turnover, it would be very helpful in that regard. Yeah. It's very difficult to come by.
Paleontologists, that's what we need to understand.
We also need paleontologists, yes. But that's an area which is growing fantastically right now. Yeah.
You showed how the size of a region is highly correlated with its species number.
Or vice versa, yeah.
Right, but that doesn't at all fit the Cape. The Cape region, which is tiny and has 6,000 species of flowering plants.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions everywhere to this, and the Cape region is one of the most incredible ones, at least for plant species richness. And, I mean, it just emphasizes that there is a lot of unique historical and geographical effect. And I wish I could understand that. There's a very similar flora which occurs in southwestern Australia in the area of Perth and so forth, another Mediterranean climate region which has very much lower diversity, even though the environments, the fire regimes and things are similar. And what explains the difference between these two areas, or between those two and anywhere else in the Mediterranean region? It's very hard to know the answers to that. Yes?
One of the things I was struck with is, actually following from the previous question, is the lack of effective history of cladogenetic history, of phylogenetic history on diversity. But one thing that you did show in a few of the slides is that there seems to be an effect of how stable a region is in paleontological terms. You showed in island biogeography that the younger islands had lower than expected diversity. In one of your first slides, you showed that forests in the Palearctic have lower diversity than expected. Could this have to do with how long a region has had to reach its equilibrium, or looking at our region, which has just come out of the Pleistocene with all the glaciations and extinctions,
Right,
etc.
yeah. There was a paper in the American Naturalist by Paul Fine and Rick Ree recently, which explored exactly that point, the fact that environments on Earth have varied in their duration in time and also their geographical extent. And certainly the tropics during the middle of the tertiary were much more broadly distributed than any other environment on Earth. And one could relate the very high diversity of the tropics to the history of the extent of those areas. Boreal regions, for example, had very limited extents apparently earlier in the tertiary. And so this very, very long history may be a part of that. And I think an interesting question is whether or not, I mean, how long does it take the diversity of a region to readjust to a change in region size? And we don't really have a good answer for that. And so if we're talking about, a long history of 30 or 40 million years, and a contraction of the size of the tropics, which has happened continually since the beginning of the Oligocene, really, do we still have the signal of a much larger area there, or is it strictly a signal of the particular environments of the tropics that allow more species to be produced and to coexist? So, I mean, these are fantastic questions, and they're going to be very interesting to get at. Yeah. Yes?
In comparison to the island model, what can we learn from the re-inhabitation of volcanic areas? I think this is a very good model for things which happen in this time, like there are not too many islands which reappear so rapidly.
Yeah, well, especially, I mean, the famous case is Krakatau, the island which blew up in 1883, anyway, somewhere around there, which has now been under fairly intensive investigation for the last century or so in terms of the repopulation of the inhabitants there. And especially, I think, Bob Whitaker at Oxford University has been following the progress of this. And it's been a very interesting thing because, first of all, it's very close in this case to sources of colonization. And so species getting there hasn't been perhaps so much of a problem, but there's also the problem of the change in the environment which has been going on, because you start with raw lava and ash, and you have to develop, sort of intact ecosystems based on those. And there's a long succession of different forms which have colonized and then built up. And so whether or not that's a better study of sort of colonization and diversification on islands, or of succession and building communities from sort of the raw environment that is left behind after the volcanic explosion. Of course, as we go out to more distant archipelagos, and the wonderful things about islands, the ones that come up, volcanic islands, is they are new, they're fresh, and they get very few inhabitants, and we can watch in the Hawaiian Islands or the Galapagos Islands how life diversifies. I mean, it's absolutely an incredible thing to see. And so these young islands, and I think during the course of the talks in the next few days, we'll probably emphasize some of these issues. And to Darwin, of course, this is a major inspiration, yeah. So yes, islands are wonderful, and young islands are even most interesting. Yeah.
Bob?
Yes?
You presented some example of what we call minimal models that have very few parameters. Okay. And on the other hand, we know that there's huge progress in our ability to quantify processes and understand the details more, like that can explain South Africa and so on.
Right.
So where are we going? Are we going to be minimalist or maximalist, or find a world between?
I think it's hard to join these two, because you get models which are reducing everything to 2 or 3 parameters, and there are many models that do this, even for complex systems like ecological systems. And at the other extreme, you have people who are setting up simulations which are very, very detailed and have competition and speciation and extinction and dispersal to different areas built into a fairly realistic kind of background, and sort of watch how things develop within these kind of semi-realistic, like sort of Sim City kinds of environments. And these are very, very different approaches, and they don't really have, I don't know whether there's a commonality, a common ground between them. because the whole concepts are quite different. In one case, you're trying to reduce things to a very, very small number of really essential attributes and processes, and the other, you're trying to replicate nature in some sense, and there's not much to bring those together. And it may be that we really have to accept the complexity of the environment and to use the kinds of ideas that I've talked about as kind of foundations for very particular studies, for looking at bits and pieces of the whole elephant, but maybe never ever really seeing the elephant in its entirety. I don't know whether you have this kind of a saying over here about the blind men and the elephant. But
yeah, maybe we should wish for some common, joining forces between reductionists and...
It would be a very interesting discussion to have, and perhaps during the next few days we can encourage this. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Nope.
Thank you.
Dinner. Thank you.